The irony wasn't lost on me, even as the metallic taste of my own blood filled my mouth. The welcome mat, cheery and woven with the words, "Home Sweet Home," was soaked in a crimson that was anything but sweet. Each ragged breath was a fresh agony, a sharp reminder of the cracked ribs grating against each other. My right arm hung at an angle so grotesquely wrong that my nurse's brain clinically catalogued it as a dislocation, even as the rest of me screamed in a symphony of pain. I had dragged myself here 3 blocks from my desecrated apartment to the one place I had ever known as a true sanctuary, my parents' doorstep. My vision was tunneling the cheerful porch light of their Denver home, blurring into a hazy halo. With the last ounce of strength I possessed, my left hand slick with blood fumbled for the doorbell. As the chime echoed faintly, the last thing I saw before darkness consumed me was the door swinging open and my mother's face collapsing into a mask of pure horror. The last thing I heard was her scream, a sound that ripped through the quiet suburban night and tore a hole in the fabric of my world. My final coherent thought was not of the man who had done this to me, but of my sister Clara, whose chilling words echoed louder than any physical blow. She had told me I should have signed the papers. It felt like a lifetime ago, though it was only a few years that the idea of Clara standing by while I was brutalized would have been unthinkable, a plot from a twisted movie, not a reality for us. We were the Evans sisters, an unbreakable unit. Growing up, Clara was my shadow, my echo, my everything. 4 years my junior, she had wide, curious eyes that looked up to me as if I held the secrets to the universe. I took my role as the older sister with the utmost seriousness. I was the one who built the most structurally sound blanket forts in our shared bedroom, the one who invented a secret language that left our parents, David and Susan, utterly baffled. I was her shield on the elementary school playground, stepping in front of bullies who mocked her lisp. I was her confidant at 16, holding her as she cried over a boy who broke her heart for the first time, assuring her that the pain would eventually fade. Our parents raised us on a steady diet of love and the gospel of family first. Sunday dinners were sacred, a time when my father would look at us over a platter of roast chicken and declare that family was our foundation. He would explain that when the storms of life came, and they always did, our family would be the anchor that held us steady. My mother would always nod in agreement, adding her own wisdom that when everything else falls apart, family remains. I absorbed these lessons like a religion, carving them into the core of my being. I never imagined that the very foundation they taught me to cherish would one day be used as a weapon to bring me to my knees. Our paths began to diverge after high school. I was pragmatic driven. I enrolled in nursing school at the University of Colorado, drawn to the structured chaos of the emergency room, to the tangible feeling of making a difference. The long nights studying, fueled by cheap coffee and sheer determination, felt like a worthy sacrifice. Clara, on the other hand, was a free spirit, or so she called it. She enrolled in a local community college for art history, but dropped out after 2 semesters, claiming it wasn't her thing. I supported her, of course. I told her that everyone finds their own timeline, their own path. While I was pulling 12-hour shifts during my residency, learning to set bones and restart hearts, Clara drifted between retail jobs, never staying anywhere for more than a few months. She was a brilliant salesperson, charming and effervescent, but she lacked discipline and grew bored easily. Despite our different trajectories, we remained close. Every Thursday was our night. I would drive to her small apartment in Capitol Hill, and we'd make homemade pasta and binge-watch terrible reality television, dissecting the manufactured drama with academic seriousness. When her beat-up Honda broke down at midnight, I was the one she called, and I would drive across the city to pick her up without a second thought. When she was short on rent because she'd splurged on front-row concert tickets, I was the one who transferred the $800 she needed, no questions asked. I didn't see it as enabling. I saw it as my duty. That was what sisters did. I had a stable career in savings. She was still finding her way. I believed I was her safety net. I never realized I was becoming her crutch. Then 5 years ago, Ethan entered the picture. Clara met him at a friend's wedding where he was bartending. He was tall, with an effortless smile and a magnetic confidence that drew people into his orbit. He charmed everyone, especially our parents. My mother remarked after their first meeting that he had such ambition. My father, a practical man who valued hard work, was deeply impressed by Ethan's grand stories about the real estate investments he was planning to make, the empire he was on the cusp of building. But from our very first introduction, a cold knot of unease formed in my stomach. It was nothing I could articulate, just a collection of small dissonant details. It was the way his smile never quite reached his cool, calculating eyes, especially when he looked at me. It was the subtle way he would correct Clara in public, his hand gripping her arm just a little too tightly as he'd laugh and tell her, "Darling, that's not quite how it happened." Others would join his laughter, but I saw the flicker of embarrassment and shame that flushed Clara's cheeks before she forced a smile. He was an expert at making a put-down sound like a term of endearment. 8 months after they met, Clara called me, her voice pitched higher than usual with a frantic sort of excitement to announce they were engaged. I forced enthusiasm into my voice, but a wave of nausea washed over me. I asked her carefully if she thought it was all a bit fast. She gave a breathless laugh and replied that when you know, you know. Besides, she added they had found the perfect apartment and needed to sign the lease by Friday. Their wedding was a lavish affair that neither of them could afford. Ethan insisted on an open bar with top-shelf liquor and a 7-tier cake that looked like it belonged at a royal wedding. Clara wore a designer gown that cost more than my first car. I later discovered they had maxed out 3 credit cards to fund the dream wedding Ethan claimed they deserved. As the maid of honor, I stood before their friends and family, my heart heavy with reservations, and delivered a heartfelt speech about sisterhood and new beginnings, choking back the words of warning that clawed at my throat. Later that night, Ethan pulled me aside, his breath heavy with expensive whiskey. His grip on my wrist was painfully tight as he leaned in, his charming smile replaced by a sneer. He told me Clara always talked about how perfect her big sister was. He wondered aloud how it must be nice to have everything all figured out. Before I could process the venom in his words, he laughed, released my wrist, and melted back into the party, leaving me rubbing the red marks on my skin, a cold dread solidifying in my gut. My sister's future felt precarious, tied to a man who seemed to resent the very stability I represented. After their honeymoon in Bali, another expense I knew they couldn't afford, a clear and disturbing pattern emerged. Ethan changed jobs frequently, always with a grandiose story about incompetent management failing to recognize his genius or a business partner trying to cheat him. He was always on the verge of a massive commission check that never seemed to materialize. Soon after, Clara quit her job at a boutique, explaining that Ethan wanted her to focus on building their home and curating their social life, which he insisted was crucial for networking. Meanwhile, their social media accounts painted a picture of extravagant success. There were photos of them at exclusive Denver restaurants, weekend getaways to Aspen, and selfies dripping in designer clothes. It was a carefully constructed illusion, and I seemed to be the only one who saw the cracks. The first time they asked for a significant amount of money was 3 months after the wedding. Clara called, her voice strained, and assured me it was just a temporary setback. She asked for $2,000 to cover their car payment, promising that Ethan's big commission was coming next month. I transferred the money. The commission never came, they never repaid me, and the next week they bought a new custom-made living room sofa. This cycle continued for years. The small loans became larger ones. The excuses grew more elaborate. The money never returned. My parents began to worry, especially when Clara and Ethan started missing family gatherings, always with a last-minute excuse about networking with important contacts. Through it all, I kept my head down. I worked, I saved, I built a quiet, stable life for myself. I bought a modest 2-bedroom condo in a safe neighborhood, a sanctuary filled with the smell of coffee, medical textbooks, and my cat Jasper. My life was predictable, but it was mine, built on my own 2 hands. Clara and Ethan's life was a whirlwind of financial chaos, artfully concealed beneath Instagram filters and designer sunglasses. The last time I saw Clara for lunch before everything shattered, I gently suggested she consider going back to school or finding a part-time job. Her response was swift and defensive. She recited what was clearly Ethan's doctrine, saying that focusing on appearances was a critical investment in his industry. Besides, she said with a dismissive wave of her hand, they were about to make a major move that would set them up for life. That major move, I would soon learn, was the dream home in Cherry Creek North. It would become the breaking point that would not just fracture our relationship but utterly obliterate the bond I thought was unbreakable, leaving me bleeding on the floor while my own sister watched me with the cold, vacant eyes of a stranger. Consciousness returned not as a gentle dawn but in brutal, fragmented shards. The piercing wail of a siren, the nauseating sway of a stretcher, bright sterile lights overhead that made my swollen eyes ache. Urgent, muffled voices speaking a language I knew intimately, the clinical shorthand of the ER, yet it felt alien when I was the subject. I felt a paramedic's hand gripping mine, his voice, a strained baritone promising me that I was safe now, that they were almost there. My father's face, etched with a grief so profound it seemed to have aged him a decade, in mere minutes swam in and out of focus. He kept repeating my name, Chloe, as if the sound of it could anchor me to the world. The emergency room at Denver Health was my territory, my second home. I knew the rhythm of this place, the controlled chaos, the smell of antiseptic, the frantic beeping of monitors. But I had never been on this side of the curtain. I had been the one documenting injuries with professional detachment, offering quiet sympathy to victims of violence. Now I was the one whose battered face was being photographed, my torn clothing carefully cut away. I heard someone, a resident I vaguely recognized, list my injuries in a detached tone, assuming I was too sedated to understand. He spoke of an orbital floor fracture, nasal bone displacement, a dislocated right shoulder with a probable labral tear. He mentioned 3 cracked ribs, a concussion, and extensive contusions. Each clinical term was a nail being hammered into the coffin of the life I had known just hours before. As they administered a sedative to manipulate my shoulder back into its socket, the world dissolved into a hazy, dreamlike state. The morphine dripped into my veins, a cool wave that dulled the sharp edges of the physical pain but did little to quell the raging inferno in my mind. In that twilight state between awareness and oblivion, the memories came unbidden and cruel. I was 8 years old again, huddled under a mountain of blankets in our shared bedroom as a ferocious thunderstorm raged outside. Lightning flashed, momentarily illuminating the floral wallpaper my mother had so carefully chosen. A clap of thunder followed so loud it rattled the windows. A small, trembling body scrambled into my bed, and 4-year-old Clara wrapped her arms around my neck, sobbing into my shoulder. I remember whispering to her that it was just a loud noise, that she was safe with me, that I would never let anything bad happen to her. She had believed me, her small body eventually relaxing into sleep, her trust in me absolute. How could that terrified little girl who had sought refuge in my arms have grown into the woman who stood silently in a doorway while her husband tried to extinguish my life? The haze shifted and another memory surfaced, this one more recent, more insidious. It was a dinner party at their ridiculously overpriced apartment about a year ago. Ethan was holding court, telling some embellished story about a real estate deal. I had asked a simple clarifying question about the zoning regulations. Ethan had stopped, given a theatrical laugh, and turned to the other guests. He'd remarked how my sister Chloe was a wonderful nurse, but her mind worked in such a linear black and white way, bless her heart. He'd added that it was why she was so good with charts and procedures, but couldn't quite grasp the fluid creative nature of high-stakes business. He said it with a smile, patting my hand condescendingly. The other guests chuckled politely. I looked to Clara, expecting her to defend me, to say something, anything. But she just offered a tight, apologetic smile and changed the subject. At the time, I dismissed it as Ethan being arrogant. Now, lying in a hospital bed, I saw it for what it was, a calculated move to isolate me, to paint me as the rigid, judgmental older sister, and to test Clara's loyalty. A test she had failed. When I was fully lucid again, a woman was sitting patiently by my bedside. She was petite, with prematurely gray hair cropped short, and the weary, intelligent eyes of someone who had seen humanity at its worst. She introduced herself as Detective Miller. Her voice was calm, her presence reassuringly solid in the swirling chaos of my thoughts. She said she knew this was difficult, but she needed to take my statement whenever I was ready. My voice was a hoarse whisper, raw from screaming and the irritation of the intubation tube they'd used during the shoulder reduction. I recounted everything from the surprise dinner to the chilling request, my research, my refusal, and the escalating harassment. Detective Miller documented every detail, her expression never changing except for a slight tightening around her eyes when I described the final, brutal assault. She looked up from her notepad when I finished, her gaze steady. She confirmed that my sister Clara had been present for the entire duration of the attack. I whispered yes, the betrayal still feeling more surreal than the physical injuries mapped across my body. I told her what Clara had said, the words that had shattered something deep inside me, that I should have signed the mortgage papers. Detective Miller shook her head almost imperceptibly, the first crack in her professional armor. She admitted that in her 15 years on the force, the depths of family betrayal still managed to shock her. She explained the legal process, the charges Ethan would face: aggravated assault, battery, burglary. Her words were a lifeline, affirming that what had happened was not a family disagreement. It was a violent crime. My parents, who had been waiting anxiously in the hallway, were allowed back in after the detective left. My mother's eyes were red and swollen, and my father's confident posture seemed to have crumbled, leaving him looking fragile and lost. My dad, his voice tight with a rage I had rarely heard, told me the police were out looking for Ethan now. He said Clara wasn't answering her phone. As if summoned by his words, she appeared in the doorway of my hospital room. She looked impeccable, impossibly composed. There were no bloodstains on her expensive silk blouse, no shadows of guilt in her eyes as she took in the sight of my bruised and bandaged body. She announced to the room not as a request but as a command that she needed to speak with her sister alone. Detective Miller, who had been conferring with a doctor just outside the door, stepped back inside, positioning herself subtly between Clara and my bed. She stated calmly that whether Clara could speak to me was entirely up to me. A strange, morbid curiosity won out. I wanted to hear it. I wanted to hear the justification, the twisted logic that had allowed this to happen. I nodded weakly. Once we were alone, Clara approached the bed not with concern but with a cautious distance, as if I were a wild animal she was afraid of provoking. She stated flatly that Ethan had been arrested. She said that this whole thing had gotten completely out of hand. The words came out of me as a pained rasp. Out of hand, I told her he had tried to kill me and she had just watched. Her response was immediate and chillingly dismissive. She told me not to be so dramatic. She admitted he had lost his temper, yes, but insisted he never meant to seriously hurt me. She adjusted the strap of her designer handbag, a nervous tic I recognized from our childhood, the only sign that she was not as composed as she appeared. She then had the audacity to suggest that I could drop the charges. She said we could handle this as a family. The medication may have been dulling my nerves, but it couldn't touch the pure, white-hot agony of that moment. I asked her why she was defending him. How could she possibly stand there looking at my broken face and justify what he did? Her defensiveness flared. She claimed I didn't understand the pressure they had been under. She spoke of the house as if it were a living entity, their future, their one chance to finally be somebody. So that justified this. I gestured with my good hand to my face, my arm in a sling. I asked if their future justified him breaking my face and dislocating my shoulder. She had the grace to look away, but there was no remorse in her voice. She said of course not, but then trailed off, studying her perfectly manicured nails. Then came the words that would define everything that followed. She looked at me, her eyes hard and resentful. She said that I always thought I knew better than everyone else, always so perfect, so responsible. She suggested that maybe for once I needed to see that my choices affected other people. The shock was so profound it felt like a physical blow worse than anything Ethan had inflicted. She was saying I deserved it. My sister, the little girl whose nightmares I had soothed, was blaming me for the violence she had witnessed. A cold calm settled over me. I told her, my voice quiet but firm, that I thought she should leave. She ignored me, continuing her pre-rehearsed speech as if I hadn't spoken. She complained that the police were being ridiculous, acting like Ethan was some kind of hardened criminal. He is, I stated, the words clear and sharp despite my swollen lips. I told her what he did to me was a felony, multiple felonies. That's when she finally looked me directly in the eye, her expression hardening into a mask of defiance I recognized from Ethan. She delivered her final manipulative threat. She warned that if I went through with this, it would destroy our family. She said Mom and Dad would be forced to choose sides. The last thread of the sister I once knew snapped. I told her that Ethan had already destroyed our family when he attacked me in my own home, and that she had destroyed it when she stood by and watched. Detective Miller returned, then, her timing impeccable. She told Clara firmly that was enough for now, that I needed to rest. As my sister turned and walked away without a backward glance, a devastating clarity washed over me. The grief was still there, a vast black ocean inside me. But beneath the surface of that ocean, something new and hard was beginning to form. It was cold and sharp and utterly resolute. This was not the end. It was the beginning. And I knew with a certainty that chilled me to my bone that I would not rest until Ethan paid for what he did to my body and Clara paid for what she did to my soul. Leaving the hospital felt less like a release and more like being pushed off a cliff. My parents drove me back to my condo, the silence in the car thick with unspoken words and suffocating grief. The yellow police tape was gone from my front door, but its ghost remained. The moment I stepped inside, the sterile, controlled environment of the hospital was violently ripped away, and the trauma of that night assaulted me anew. The air was stale thick with the phantom scent of Ethan's cologne and my own dried blood. A large, ugly dent in the drywall where he had slammed my head was a permanent scar on my home, a brutal monument to the attack. My shattered favorite vase had been swept up, but I could still see the fine dust of its remains in the grout between the kitchen tiles. My body, a roadmap of purple and yellow bruises, screamed in protest with every step. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow in the corner sent a jolt of pure terror through me. My sanctuary had become a haunted house, and I was its only ghost. The days that followed were a blur of agonizing slowness. Physical recovery was a full-time job. The physical therapist was a cheerful, relentless woman who pushed my shoulder through excruciating exercises, telling me that pain was a sign of healing. To me, it was just a constant visceral echo of Ethan's violence. The nightmares were the worst part. I would wake up gasping for air, the phantom sensation of his hands on me so real that I'd scramble out of bed and turn on every light in the apartment, my heart hammering against my cracked ribs. The reflection in the mirror was a stranger's. My left eye was still ringed with a sickly green-yellow hue, my nose slightly crooked and my face puffy and asymmetrical. This was the face Ethan had given me. This was the face Clara had watched him create. The anger, a cold, dense star in my chest, began to burn brighter, consuming the fear and the grief. The true peak of my suffering, however, did not come from a physical pang or a nightmare. It came from my own parents. They visited one Sunday afternoon, bringing with them a pot roast that smelled of my childhood, a scent that now seemed to belong to another life. They sat awkwardly on my new, unfamiliar sofa. After minutes of strained small talk, my father cleared his throat and began. He spoke, his voice heavy with a weary sadness, about the importance of family, about the destructive nature of holding on to anger. He talked about forgiveness, not for Ethan's sake, he clarified, but for my own, so that I could heal and move on. My mother, her eyes pleading, added her part. She whispered about Clara, how lost and confused she was, how she was under Ethan's influence. She worried aloud that a public trial would utterly destroy what was left of our family, forcing everyone to choose sides and leaving wounds that would never heal. Then came the suggestion, wrapped in the language of love and concern, but feeling like a dagger to my heart. They suggested we could try mediation. Perhaps if I dropped the criminal charges, we could handle this privately. Ethan could agree to anger management, to therapy. My mother had whispered, find a way to move forward together. I stared at them, the pot roast turning to ash in my stomach. They saw a family crisis that needed to be managed, a messy situation to be smoothed over. They did not see what I saw, a violent crime and an unforgivable betrayal. In their desperation to keep the foundation of our family from crumbling, they were asking me to bury the truth, to swallow my pain, to pretend that the fault lines running through our lives weren't already canyons. In that moment, I had never felt more alone. The little girl who had once believed her family was an unbreachable fortress now understood that she was entirely on her own. I thanked them calmly for the roast, my voice devoid of all emotion. As I closed the door behind them, I knew that my path forward would not be one of forgiveness. It would be one of meticulously planned, ruthlessly executed justice. My justice. That night, after flushing the sedatives my doctor had prescribed down the toilet, I made a call. Maya and I had been best friends since college, but our lives had taken different paths. While I was suturing wounds, she was exposing them. As a freelance investigative journalist, she had a healthy disdain for authority, a talent for digging into the dark corners of people's lives, and a loyalty to me that was absolute. When I told her what had happened, she didn't offer platitudes or sympathy. There was a long silence on the line, and then her voice, low and dangerous, asked a single question: what did I want to do about it? That was the beginning. My revenge would not be a crime of passion. I was a nurse. I was methodical, precise, and I understood pressure points. My plan would be the same. Ethan and Clara had built their entire world on a foundation of lies, a carefully curated image of wealth and success. I would not destroy them with a single blow. I would dismantle their world brick by fraudulent brick until the entire rotten structure came crashing down upon them. Our first target was their reputation. Ethan's charm was his primary currency. I would render it worthless. From my living room, which had become my war room, I directed Maya. I gave her every piece of information I had, the names of companies Ethan claimed to have worked for, the important contacts he and Clara were always name-dropping, the vague details of his past real estate deals. Maya was a phantom. She spent a week making quiet inquiries using burner phones and encrypted emails. The information she unearthed was better than I could have hoped. Ethan's resume was a masterpiece of fiction. A major deal he'd bragged about closing in Vail was a complete fabrication. The property owners had never heard of him. He hadn't left his previous job because of incompetent management. He'd been fired for falsifying expense reports. Best of all, Maya found a digital trail of unpaid bills and angry vendors from their lavish wedding, including a florist and a caterer who were still owed thousands of dollars. The weapon of choice was a popular anonymous Denver society blog known for its salacious gossip. Maya crafted an exposé, a masterpiece of veiled accusations and leading questions. It didn't name Ethan directly, but referred to a charming Cherry Creek couple whose lifestyle seemed to be funded by aspirations rather than assets. It detailed a lavish wedding with a mountain of hidden debt. It questioned the legitimacy of a certain real estate guru's recent career claims and hinted at a pattern of questionable business ethics. Maya timed its release for a Friday afternoon, ensuring it would be the talk of the weekend among Denver's elite. The night the post went live, I sat in the dark, my laptop the only source of light. I watched as the link was shared across social media. At first, there were a few defenders, friends of theirs calling it baseless gossip. But then the unpaid florist commented, confirming her story. A former colleague of Ethan's chimed in, vaguely alluding to his creative accounting. The tide turned swiftly. The comments became a torrent of suspicion and mockery. I navigated to Clara's Instagram page. For the past 2 years, it had been a relentless feed of perfection: champagne brunches, ski trips, designer bags. But that night it was a battlefield. People were asking pointed questions in the comments of her latest post, a ridiculously posed photo of her and Ethan at a polo match. I watched as she frantically deleted the negative comments, but they came faster than she could keep up. Then, about an hour after the onslaught began, she made a new post. It was a defiant photo of her and Ethan smiling, forced smiles with a caption about how they would not be brought down by the jealousy of unhappy people. It was a mistake. The post reeked of desperation and only added fuel to the fire. The comments were brutal. Someone asked if her designer handbag had been paid for or if it was part of their aspirational financing plan. A strange sensation washed over me as I scrolled through the digital carnage. The constant grinding ache in my ribs seemed to lessen. The screaming in my head, the endless loop of Clara's voice telling me I should have signed the papers, quieted for the first time. It was replaced by a low, steady hum. It was the hum of control, of power. They had made me a victim, powerless and broken on my own floor. But now, sitting in the shadows of my violated home, I was pulling the strings. I had taken their most prized possession, their perfect, shiny image, and I had smashed it. A cold, dark satisfaction bloomed in my chest. It was a terrifying, intoxicating feeling. This was only the first brick. I looked over at the dent in my wall, not with fear, but with a newfound purpose. I had a whole architecture of ruin left to build. The digital humiliation was satisfying, but I knew it was merely an appetizer. Public opinion is fickle. Scorn and gossip fade. To truly dismantle Ethan and Clara's world, I needed to attack its structural supports: Ethan's career and their finances. The blog post had created the cracks. Now it was time to apply the pressure that would make the whole facade collapse. My grief had not disappeared, but it had transmuted, crystallizing into a diamond-hard resolve. My mind, once clouded with trauma and pain, was now sharp-focused and operating with the clinical precision I normally reserved for a critical patient in the ER. My next move required a deeper, more personal infiltration. I knew from Clara's past complaints that Ethan was obsessively private about his computer and phone, a classic red flag I'd ignored at the time. But he had one weakness: arrogance. He believed he was smarter than everyone else, which made him careless. During one of my Thursday night visits months before the attack, Clara had been complaining that their Wi-Fi was slow. I, the ever-helpful sister, had offered to take a look. While troubleshooting, I had noticed a sticky note on the underside of Ethan's desk with a series of letters and numbers. On a hunch, I snapped a quick, discreet photo with my phone. At the time, I thought it might be a product key for some software. Now I knew it was a key of a different sort. Working with Maya, we enlisted the help of a freelance cybersecurity expert. She knew a man who went only by Silas and operated in the gray areas of the digital world. I didn't ask questions. I just provided him with the password from the photo. It was a long shot, but Ethan's arrogance paid off. He had used the same complex password for everything, including his personal cloud storage. Within hours, Silas sent Maya a secured file. It was a digital treasure trove, Ethan's entire fraudulent life laid bare. There were 2 sets of financial records. One, meticulously fabricated with inflated income and assets, was for bank and loan applications. The other, the real one, showed a mountain of debt and a pathetic trickle of actual income. There were emails to potential investors for a real estate development fund that was nothing more than a concept using doctored photos of properties he had no claim to. He was running a small-scale Ponzi scheme using money from new investors to pay off older ones and fund his lavish lifestyle. He was a predator, and Clara was his willing accomplice, enjoying the spoils of his deception. The most damning discovery was a chain of emails between Ethan and his business partner in a recent deal. The partner was accusing Ethan of embezzling funds from their joint account. Ethan's replies were a masterclass in gaslighting and threats warning the partner that going public would result in mutual destruction. This was the thread I would pull to unravel everything. My plan was twofold. First, the career. Ethan was currently trying to secure a position at a prestigious commercial real estate firm in Denver, a job that would give him the legitimacy he craved and access to a whole new pool of wealthy victims. I had overheard him boasting about it to my father weeks before the attack. He was in the final round of interviews. Silas, at my direction, crafted an anonymous email. It was sent from a temporary, untraceable address to the head of HR and the CEO of the firm. The email was polite, professional, and devastating. It claimed to be from a concerned industry peer who had reason to believe the firm was not aware of Mr. Ethan Hayes' full professional history. Attached were 2 documents stripped of all metadata. The first was the email chain with his former partner, clearly showing the accusations of embezzlement. The second was a redacted version of Ethan's fabricated financial statement placed side by side with screenshots of public records showing liens against his assets. The email concluded by simply suggesting that the firm conduct its own thorough due diligence. We didn't need to prove anything, we just needed to plant the seed of doubt. A firm like that wouldn't risk the liability or the scandal. I imagined the moment Ethan received the call. The polite rejection, the vague corporate speak about moving in a different direction, the cold dread as he realized his dream job had evaporated, the impotent rage of a con man who had been out-conned. As I pictured it, the phantom pain in my shoulder subsided, replaced by a feeling of profound, icy satisfaction. It was the feeling of a debt being paid. He had tried to ruin my future. I was simply returning the favor. The second part of the plan was more personal. It was for Clara. My parents, still trying to fix our family, had been giving her money since Ethan's arrest, believing her story that she was a victim too, left with nothing. I needed them and the world to see her complicity. Among the files Silas had recovered was a folder of credit card statements. Clara had her own card linked to one of Ethan's accounts. I spent a night meticulously going through the statements, my nursing skills for detailed chart review proving useful. I cross-referenced the dates of her extravagant purchases: a $3,000 handbag, a $1,500 spa day, a weekend trip to a vineyard, with the dates of the desperate pleading texts she had sent me, asking for money for groceries or an unexpected car repair. The pattern was sickeningly clear. She wasn't just surviving, she was thriving on deceit, using my hard-earned money to subsidize her life of luxury while simultaneously lying to my face. I compiled a simple, undeniable document, a timeline. On one side, a screenshot of a text from Clara claiming she couldn't afford her electricity bill. On the other, the credit card statement from the same day showing a $700 charge at a high-end boutique. I made several such comparisons, each one a testament to her calculated deception. The next time my mother came to visit, her face etched with worry about poor Clara, I didn't argue. I simply handed her the file. I told her I knew she wanted to help my sister, but that I thought she deserved to know where her money was actually going. I watched her as she sat at my kitchen table and read. I saw the progression of emotions on her face: confusion, then denial, then a dawning, horrified understanding. The image of her perfect, struggling younger daughter was being systematically dismantled by the black and white reality of the evidence in her hands. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with a new kind of pain, the pain of betrayal, a pain I knew all too well. She didn't say anything. She just quietly gathered the papers, her hands trembling slightly, and left. The phone call came 2 hours later. It was my father. His voice was grim, stripped of the weary optimism he'd had before. He told me they had confronted Clara. At first, she had tried to lie to spin a story, but faced with the undeniable proof, she had crumbled. He said they had told her they would support her in getting therapy and finding a job, but the financial support was over effective immediately. He paused, and then he said the words I had been waiting to hear since I woke up in the hospital. He told me he was sorry. He was sorry he hadn't seen it, sorry he had pushed me to forgive, and sorry he hadn't protected me. After I hung up, I walked to my window and looked out at the city lights. The constant heavy weight I had been carrying in my chest since the attack felt perceptibly lighter. I had severed Ethan's professional lifeline and Clara's financial one. I had forced my parents to see the truth. Each successful step of my plan was a dose of powerful medicine, not healing the original wound but reducing the inflammation, dulling the chronic pain of victimhood. There was no joy in it, not in the way one feels joy at a party or a celebration. It was a quieter, colder emotion. It was the grim satisfaction of a surgeon excising a cancer. The work was brutal but necessary for survival. And my work was not yet finished. The weeks leading up to the preliminary court hearing were a study in contrasts. On the outside, my life was a regimen of healing. Physical therapy was slowly coaxing my shoulder back to a semblance of its former mobility. The bruises on my face had faded from violent purples to sullen yellows, and with clever makeup, I could almost look like my old self. I was following my lawyer's instructions, documenting everything and preparing my statement. I was by all accounts a model victim, resilient, cooperative, and focused on justice. But on the inside, a profound and unsettling transformation was taking place. The fiery rage that had fueled my initial acts of revenge had cooled, solidifying into something colder, denser, and far more patient. I was no longer an avenging angel acting on instinct. I was a scientist observing the results of a carefully constructed experiment. I had introduced a catalyst, the truth, into the unstable chemical compound of their lives, and now I was watching with clinical detachment the inevitable explosive reaction. The satisfaction I had felt was no longer a hot rush, but a slow, quiet hum, the sound of a perfectly calibrated machine doing its work. The first reports from the blast radius came from my mother. She called me one evening, her voice a fragile, weary thing. She told me Clara had called her not in tears of remorse, but in a hysterical fit of rage and panic. The family credit card had been declined at a gourmet grocery store. My mother had calmly explained to her, as my father had instructed, that the financial support was over. According to my mother, Clara's reaction was one of pure, uncomprehending shock. She had apparently screamed into the phone asking what she was supposed to do, how she was supposed to live. She accused my mother of abandoning her, of taking my side. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of her actions, only the bewildered fury of a pampered child whose endless line of credit had just been abruptly cut. As my mother recounted the painful conversation, I felt nothing. No pity, no sympathy, not even a flicker of familial connection. I simply processed the information. Clara had never seen our parents' money or mine as a gift. She saw it as an entitlement, a resource as natural and constant as the air she breathed. Her shock wasn't that she had done something wrong. It was that the world had suddenly stopped obeying the rules she had come to expect. She was a ghost at a feast that had been cleared away, rattling her chains and wondering why no one was listening. Next came Ethan's implosion, relayed to me by my father. After his job offer at the prestigious firm was rescinded without explanation, Ethan had descended into a state of furious paranoia. He had called my father not to apologize for nearly killing his daughter, but to demand to know what he had done. He had ranted about conspiracies, about professional jealousy, accusing my father of using his connections to sabotage him. My dad, in a voice colder than I had ever heard him use, had simply told Ethan that a man's reputation is a house he builds himself, and that his, it seemed, was built on sand. Then he had hung up. The pressure was mounting. Their social circle poisoned by the gossip blog, and Ethan's now obvious professional failures had evaporated. The sycophants and fair-weather friends who had once flocked to their parties were now nowhere to be found. They were isolated, radioactive, trapped together in their overpriced apartment with dwindling funds and mounting legal bills. The silence from their usually vibrant social media accounts was deafening. There were no more staged photos, no more boasts of success. Their digital world had gone dark. The final public blow came about a week before the hearing. Maya sent me a link to a public notice website. There it was in cold black and white print, an eviction notice filed by the management of their luxury apartment building for non-payment of rent. I imagined the scene with crystalline clarity, the notice taped to their gleaming front door for all their neighbors to see. I pictured Clara, a woman who lived for appearances, having to face the pitying and scornful glances of people she had once tried so desperately to impress. I imagined Ethan, his charm curdled into pure rage, having no one to blame but the woman beside him and the world that had refused to bend to his will. The beautiful cage they had built for themselves had become a prison, and now they were being thrown out of it. The silence I had created was no longer metaphorical. It became real, tangible, a vacuum where their life used to be. And it was in this vacuum that Clara finally broke. She appeared outside my apartment building 2 days before the hearing. I saw her on my security camera feed, a feature my father had insisted on installing. She looked like a stranger. Her expensive clothes hung limply on her thinner frame, her hair was unkempt, and her face, stripped of its usual perfect makeup, was pale and gaunt. She didn't buzz. She just stood on the sidewalk looking up at my window, a specter of the sister I once knew. Against my better judgment, but compelled by the cold curiosity of my new self, I went down. I didn't open the main door, but spoke to her through the intercom, my voice clear and steady through the small speaker. Her voice, when it came, was a ragged, desperate sound, completely devoid of its former confidence. She told me I had to stop. She pleaded, her words tumbling over each other, that I had won, that I had ruined them. She asked what more I could possibly want from them. I let her words hang in the empty air of the lobby. I felt my heart beating a slow, steady rhythm, my body calm, my mind clear. I told her, my voice as flat and dispassionate as a surgeon's, that what she was experiencing wasn't my victory. It was the consequence. It was the simple, unavoidable result of the choices she and her husband had made. She began to sob, then great gulping, ugly sounds. She wailed that it wasn't fair, that her life was over, that she had nothing left. The self-pity was so profound, so absolute, it was almost impressive. Even now, at the absolute nadir of her existence, her thoughts were only of herself. I waited for her sobs to subside slightly before I spoke again. I asked her if she remembered the sound my shoulder had made when it popped out of its socket. I asked if she remembered the taste of blood, because I did every single day. I told her that the life she thought was over was a fantasy, an illusion paid for with my money and Ethan's lies. I said that this ugly, painful reality was the first real thing she had experienced in years. A deathly silence followed. I had expected more screaming, more accusations, but there was nothing. Through the security camera, I could see her face. It was completely slack, her mouth slightly agape. It was the face of someone who had not only been defeated, but had been utterly, fundamentally understood in a way that stripped away every last defense. The truth of my words had hit her with the force of a physical blow, and she had no response. All the lies, all the deflections, all the self-pity, they were useless. She stood there for a long moment, completely still, before turning and walking away, her steps unsteady, her shoulders slumped in a way that had nothing to do with expensive fabric. As I watched her disappear down the street, the cold hum of satisfaction inside me finally faded. It was replaced by a vast, quiet emptiness. The architect of ruin had completed her work. The house of lies had fallen, and now I stood alone in the silence of its dust. The day of the trial did not arrive with a clap of thunder, but with a quiet, gray Denver dawn that seemed to absorb all sound. The rage, the meticulous planning, the cold satisfaction, all those powerful driving forces had receded, leaving behind a vast, calm emptiness. I was no longer an architect of ruin. I was simply a witness here to observe the final demolition of a structure that was already condemned. I dressed not in a power suit, but in a simple, modest dress, my arm no longer in a sling but still cradled protectively against my side. The face I saw in the mirror was my own again, but the eyes were different. They held a quiet, weary knowledge that could never be unlearned. The courtroom was a sterile, hushed environment of polished wood and muted light. My parents sat in the front row, their faces a mixture of grief, shame, and a desperate hope for some kind of resolution. They looked smaller than I had ever seen them, aged by the schism that had torn through the foundation they held so sacred. I did not sit with them. My journey here had been a solitary one, and I felt it had to end the same way. Then I saw them. Ethan and Clara entered from a side door with his public defender. The transformation was absolute and horrifying. Ethan, the man of effortless charm and expensive suits, was a ghost of his former self. He wore an ill-fitting suit that was clearly off the rack, his confident posture replaced by a sullen, resentful slump. His eyes, once full of calculated charisma, were now dull and empty, save for a flicker of impotent fury directed at the world that had dared to hold him accountable. He was a king dethroned, stripped of his borrowed finery, left with nothing but the pathetic, hollow man he had always been. But it was Clara who held my gaze. If Ethan was a ghost, she was a void. She was impossibly thin, swimming in a drab dress that seemed to have drained all the color from her skin. Her face was a blank canvas, her eyes fixed on the floor in front of her, as if the weight of the ceiling would crush her if she looked up. She radiated a silence that was more profound than any scream. It was the silence of a soul that has been completely hollowed out, first by a man's manipulation and then by the brutal reflection of her own choices. When my turn came to testify, I walked to the stand with a steady, measured gait. I did not look at them. I looked at the prosecutor, a sharp, empathetic woman who had listened to my story without an ounce of judgment. I recounted the events of that night, my voice even and clinical. I spoke of the assault, not with the trembling terror of a victim, but with the detached precision of a nurse reading from a patient's chart. I detailed the fractures, the dislocation, the contusions. I described the sound of my own bones breaking, the feel of my own blood filling my mouth. The prosecutor asked what I had felt when I saw my sister standing in the doorway. I paused, the clinical facade momentarily cracking. I told the court that in that moment, the physical pain had become irrelevant. What I felt, I explained, was the death of something, the death of the little girl. I had protected the death of the bond I had believed to be unbreakable, the death of the very concept of family as a sanctuary. Then she asked me to repeat the words Clara had said. I took a breath and spoke them into the silent courtroom. She had told me I should have signed the mortgage. I saw a few jury members flinch, their eyes darting towards Clara, who seemed to sink even further into herself, becoming almost invisible. Ethan's defense was predictable and pathetic. His lawyer tried to paint me as a jealous, controlling older sister resentful of their success. He tried to frame the assault as a family dispute that went too far, a momentary loss of temper fueled by financial stress. Ethan sat at the table, nodding along, a petulant child trying to escape blame. The pivotal moment of the trial, and perhaps of my entire life, came when the defense made a fatal strategic error. They called Clara to the stand. They clearly expected her to support Ethan's narrative, to minimize his violence, to paint a picture of a loving husband pushed to the brink. She walked to the stand like a person walking to her own execution. She was sworn in, her voice an inaudible whisper. For a long moment she said nothing, simply staring at her hands, which were twisted in her lap. The defense attorney began his gentle, leading questions, attempting to coax out the story they had rehearsed. But something different happened. When he asked her to describe that night from her perspective, she looked up. For the first time, she looked directly at me. Her eyes were not filled with hate or resentment or self-pity. They were filled with a terrible, desolate emptiness. And then she began to speak, her voice soft but clear, each word dropping into the silence of the courtroom like a stone into a deep well. She did not tell their story. She told the truth. She spoke of her own insecurity, of her desperate need to feel important, to live up to the glittering life Ethan had promised her. She admitted that she had resented me, my stability, my independence, my perfect life that she felt she could never achieve on her own. She confessed that this resentment had made it easy to believe Ethan when he told her I was the one holding them back, that my cautiousness was a form of jealousy. She then described the assault. She didn't spare herself. She recounted watching Ethan smash my head against the wall, the sickening sound of my shoulder dislocating. She told the court, her voice cracking for the first time, that her first thought had not been of me, her sister bleeding on the floor. Her first thought, she admitted through a choked sob, was a selfish, panicked thought about the house, about the dream life that was now slipping through their fingers. She confessed that the words she had spoken to me, that I should have signed the papers, came from the ugliest, most rotten part of her soul. She looked at the jury, tears streaming down her hollow cheeks, and whispered a question to the room. She asked, what kind of person does that? What kind of person watches her own sister being brutalized and blames her for it? A profound silence descended upon the courtroom. It was the sound of a lie finally dying. I watched Ethan's face contort, first in disbelief, then in pure, unadulterated rage. He had been betrayed not by me, but by the one person he thought he had under his absolute control. In that moment, he was finally and truly alone. I felt no triumph. The cold satisfaction was gone, washed away by a wave of immense, profound sadness. I was not watching my enemy fall. I was watching my sister confess to her own damnation, and I was mourning the little girl in the floral wallpapered room who had been lost somewhere along the way. The verdict was a formality. Guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced Ethan to 7 years in a state prison, citing the brutal nature of the crime and his complete lack of remorse. As they led him away in handcuffs, he shot a look of pure venom at Clara, a final silent threat. She didn't even flinch. She just sat there, staring into nothing. In the courthouse hallway, as my parents hovered nearby, Clara approached me. She stood a few feet away, a chasm of pain and betrayal between us. She didn't ask for forgiveness. I knew then that she understood it was something she could not ask for, and I was not ready to give. She simply said, her voice still a whisper, that her therapy had taught her that recovery begins with telling the truth, even if it's the ugliest truth in the world. She told me she was just sorry that she had to destroy my life before she could start telling it. Then she turned and walked away, her new solitary life waiting for her. Months have passed since that day. I live in a new apartment across town, one with no ghosts in the walls. The physical scars have faded, though my shoulder still aches when a storm rolls in, a permanent barometer of my trauma. The emotional healing is a quieter, more complicated process. My revenge was successful. I dismantled their world, exposed their lies, and ensured justice was served. But the victory did not fill the hole their betrayal left behind. It only swept the area clean so that I could see the full, devastating extent of the void. I've learned the most expensive lesson of all, that sometimes the opposite of love isn't hate, but a terrible, corrosive indifference. Clara didn't hate me. In her own twisted way, she probably loved me. But she loved the illusion of the life she wanted more. I had to learn that setting a boundary is not an act of aggression. It is a profound act of self-love. I had to learn that family is not a suicide pact and loyalty should never require you to set yourself on fire to keep someone else warm. My relationship with my parents is slowly rebuilding now based on a more honest, more painful truth. My relationship with Clara is quiet. We do not speak. Perhaps one day we will, but it will be as two different people, strangers meeting for the first time with the ghost of the sisters we used to be hovering between us. Sometimes in the quiet of the evening, I think about the cold satisfaction I felt as I pulled the threads of their lives apart. It was a powerful anesthetic, numbing the pain and giving me a purpose. But it wasn't a cure. The cure I'm learning is quieter. It's in the steady rhythm of my work in community health, helping people before they reach a crisis. It's in the warmth of my cat purring on my lap. It's in the acceptance that what happened to me is now a part of my story, a dark, defining chapter, but not the last one. I survived. I fought back. And in the quiet aftermath, I am slowly, painstakingly learning how to simply live again.